trees fell and the trees fell, one by one, 20 in a day. Nothing could stand in my Vauxhall's way, and the trees fell.
The land was rugged and raw, and so were the men who worked in the woods. They had to be. Life in the northern country wasn't easy. If the trees weren't cut, regardless of the weather, money wasn't being made. While the occupation was hard and sometimes dangerous, there weren't many other opportunities, besides mining, for making a living. For $30 a month, the lumberjacks made do with what life had to offer them in the Upper Peninsula.
It was a young man's work. We didn't go home all winter, some of the people. And some of the ones that were bachelors didn't have any place to go.
It does build character on people, and it makes you realize how tough life is compared to what it is today. So, and no, I wouldn't want to go back. Nothing. Once is enough.
A lot of the lumberjacks that wandered around in this area too were just that, wanderers, drifters, just like the cowboys they portrayed down west.
In the late 1800s, major lumber operations moved west from Maine to the Lower Peninsula of Michigan and finally to the Upper Peninsula.
During the 1860s, when the logging started here on the Menominee and the Cedar River, there were a lot of returning men from the Civil War. And I remember seeing that, and then later the Spanish-American War.
The first men to explore and find trees for harvesting were called landlookers, also known as timber cruisers. A landlooker estimated the worth of standing timber.
It was an occupation for an educated man. He had to know math, and it had to be a good woodsman too. So it was, I think it was one that was probably enjoyable for the ones that did it.
The trees the landlookers found valuable were the white pines. Hence, the period from 1860 to 1914 became known as the White Pine Era.
I consider it romantic. We had steamboats on the Great Lakes that were carrying lumber down. It was a boom time. It was like the old gold rush days.
The white pines were mainly used for constructing homes and buildings. In fact, after Chicago was destroyed by fire in 1871, much of the UP timber went to rebuild that city.
From here, the lumber was sawed here, was shipped on sailing schooners to begin with to Chicago, to Buffalo, all the ports on the Great Lakes.
And it's been reported that some of the UP timber even went to build palaces in England. Logs during the white pine era averaged up to 4 feet in diameter. The largest white pine ever harvested by the Chicago Lumbering Company of Michigan was in 1898 from what is now the Hiawatha National Forest in northern Schoolcraft County. The legend of this log was recorded in the book Lumberjack by William S. Crow, who came to the UP in 1893 and later organized his own lumber company. The legendary log measured 7.5 feet in diameter at the stump and was cut into 16 logs, 16 feet long. It took the men half a day to fell the tree. Like so much timber then, this legendary log journeyed to the sawmill via the waterways. However, bigger was not always better when it came to floating logs down the Driggs River in the eastern UP.
That log was too big to float the river. You know, they'd put it in and it would roll over and hang up on the other side. So his story was that they sent Harvey Cookson up with dynamite and an auger and blew it into 3 pieces, and that Mr. Cookson rode it down the river.
Well, some of them logs weighed 300 to 400 pounds. And most of them you had to carry, and when you cut them on 4 or 5 foot of snow, you limbed them on top of that snow, and then you put them on your back to put them in a pile.
It was also documented in the book Lumberjack that during the white pine era, some trees harvested in Marquette County had to be split lengthways because they wouldn't fit through the 6-foot square doors of the sawmills. There were many such accounts that were larger than life, bigger than the size of the woodman's patron saint, Paul Bunyan. But these mammoth stories couldn't have been possible without the men leading the lives of lumberjacks.
Yeah, Paul Bunyan was mostly the northeast section of the country, actually, but he came here with the loggers from back east, too. One of the drives they held on the Yellow Dog River, they were coming down the river driving these logs. Then they kept driving and driving. They didn't seem to come to the end of the river. They couldn't figure what was the matter. Well, what had happened, the river went in a circle. And when Paul discovered this is what had happened, well, what he did, he hitched Babe's blue ox in his chain around that Yellow Dog River, and he just jerked that sucker out straight, you see, so that he could drive it down to Lake Independence.
Living conditions in some of the camps were tough. In order to bathe, most lumberjacks visited a nearby frigid stream, and the clean linens were hard to come by for their straw beds. While living conditions varied from camp to camp and company to company, it still took a certain individual to want to live and work in the woods.
A logging camp was a men's camp with double bunk beds. They had to sleep 2 persons in it, full of bed bugs. And they never seemed to get rid of the bed bugs.
They would have about a 200-man camp for about every section of land that they cut. A section is 640 acres. That's about all the sawyers could walk in a day and then get back to the camps.
Now the smaller camps normally lasted maybe 2 years because they would harvest them right around the camp and then they would tear them down and move them somewhere else. And they didn't put really good material in them because they were always being moved.
The lumberjacks came from diverse ethnic backgrounds. The workers were Scandinavian, French, Canadian, and German. But even with the growing population, sometimes there was a shortage of workers in the woods.
Before the Depression, they were running short of men up here to do the logging. So they sent out what they called man catchers. And these man catchers would go to the cities and try and recruit fellas to come up here. The foreman would say, here, give me your bags, we'll keep them, for safekeeping, we'll keep them over here. Well, the reason for taking the bags is if you got the guy's bag, he's not so likely to leave right away. You know, he may stick around for just a little bit.
People that didn't live through a depression like that can't imagine how hard it was. We had a couple of guys come to our camp one time that wanted a job. Did they eat? Whew, he was eating with both hands. I had never seen anyone eat with both hands before in my life. And then World War II started, and logging was a vital industry. So foods were not rationed for the logging camps. So we had lots of sugar to bake with, lots of meat.
A fellow by the name of Hildenbrand came in, and he's the one that got the German war prisoners when we ran out of men during World War II to cut the wood. And these guys that worked in my area, I had 50 to start with and 100 at the end, and they were wonderful boys to work with. They were Finnish, Austrians, and Polish boys.
A couple of Italian men came here, and they told him, have you any friends from Italy that would come? And before you know it, the Italian people were coming to work here, and then the Croatian people came also. So we had little settlements where those people lived.
Working in the woods was one of the most dangerous jobs at that time. The men were far from hospitals and civilization, and one false move could end the career of a lumberjack.
Well, a widowmaker would be a dead piece of wood up in the tree. They're just hanging by itself from a branch, or maybe a dead branch itself still on the tree, and that killed a lot of people by starting to chop on a tree, and the branch would come loose all of a sudden and drop so fast they wouldn't have time to get out of the way.
All my life he was a lumberjack. In 1918, he took a job scaling logs at Brown Lumber Company in Manistee. He was scaling logs going into the hot pond, and the pile came down and fractured his hip, and he died.
Even with the onset of modern technology, such as the replacement of the crosscut with the chainsaw in the 1940s, the job of a woodsman was still hazardous. Tragic accidents continued even after the switch from horses and oxen in the 1940s to gasoline engines.
One truck driver got killed, but it was his carelessness. He didn't put the chains over the loads of logs right, somehow or other, and when he went to dump them in by the mill down to Munising, one rolled down his back. It didn't break a bone, but he died.
And there was another man that got killed as a tractor driver. He worked for Wally Remington. He rode up over a log, up high, and when the tractor, the front end dropped down, he flew out and landed in front of the tractor, and the tractor ran over him.
Since many lumber companies owned the logging camps where the men would eat and sleep, if a lumberjack became disabled and unable to work, he would lose not only his income, but also his home and his meals.
When grandfather bought the company, one of the first things he did was start selling the houses to the families that lived in them so that they had some security.
The day in the life of a lumberjack, known as a shanty boy before the term lumberjack became popular, started at 5 a.m. The men lived in company-owned lumber camps managed by camp bosses who woke the men before sunrise.
One of the woods bosses, they had given him the nickname Moonlight Johnson. And the reason was he got the guys up when it was still dark. And they'd have breakfast, feed them good. And then they'd head them for the woods, and they'd get them out in the woods so that the lumberjacks would be in the woods ready to cut logs when the first light of day came up.
My dad did a lot of moonlight work during the winter times, and I got old enough to work with him. Go out, and if it was light enough to work, we'd cut during the night. And that's why the foresters would wonder how come we cut off the job so quick. We'd cut night and day. Well, of course, we got a little rest.
The cook was always the first person up in a logging camp. The cook would light the wood stove and let it warm up for at least a half an hour before preparing a meal big enough to feed 20 to 30 men.
It was interesting, and I liked to cook for them. They liked food, and I didn't mind cooking for them at all.
During the months of balmy weather, the dining hall, known as the cook shanty, became hot during the day, so most of the baking was done in the morning. In the winter time, the buildings weren't insulated, so the warmth from the wood stove was always inviting to the camp crew. The cook's assistant was called a cookie. The cookie's job was to peel the vegetables and serve the meals to the men.
As cookie, he had to have all the cook fires built, everything, and start to get out the pots and pans.
There were also chore boys who split the wood for the stove and hauled supplies. Breakfast was an important meal. The men ate foods high in carbohydrates and fats to sustain them for a hard day of work in the woods. The lumberjacks ate doorknobs, morning glories, and red horse, and drank black lead. In modern English, that's biscuits, pancakes, corned beef, and coffee.
My grandmother cooked for the men in the woods in the camp. She made bread, coffee cakes, and donuts and cookies and stuff like that.
We had heavy breakfast, so they had bacon. Sometimes I even cooked pork chops for breakfast. And they liked lots of pancakes and syrup and such stuff like that, And they worked hard, so they deserved it.
The cook was the boss in the cook shanty. Lumberjacks were assigned seats and given only 30 minutes to eat. A newcomer to the camp was immediately assigned a seat in the cook shanty, and nobody dared to sit in another man's place.
Yeah, everybody had their own place. When they give you a place on the table, that was your place. And nobody was supposed to sit there. If a newcomer come to camp, well, when the bell would ring, for the men to come to eat, well, he was supposed to be on the tail end of the line.
While the wages were important to lumberjacks, they picked the best camp to work by the quality of the food. During meals, absolutely no talking was allowed. Some say it was to avoid an argument between the temperamental workers, while others say it was to get the lumberjacks fed and into the woods working as soon as possible.
No talk, absolutely. Just please pass, and that was it. If you started a conversation, a cookie come tap you on the shoulder, shut up.
So they had kind of hand signals, or they had enough courtesy to pass the serving plates on down,
The men would usually head out to the woods by 6 a.m., or at least when it was light enough to safely fell trees. There they used two tools to bring down the huge trees, the axe and the crosscut saw. A man's axe was his pride and joy, and you never touched another man's blade if you wanted to keep all your own digits. The other tool was the crosscut, which required the strength of two men.
Everything was sawed by hand, of course. It didn't have chainsaws then.
What's a sawyer? He's the man who cut the trees down. There was usually two men doing it. They used a two-man crosscut saw.
That was a 5.5-foot saw. And a man on one end, one on the other end. Saw that.
They would place a notch in the side they wanted it to fall, and then cut from the back side coming in from above the notch. And that way they would have a good direction to fall it.
While the white pine was a soft wood and easy to cut, the pitch was sticky and would build up on the blade, causing delays. So the men sprinkled kerosene, normally used for the campfires, on the saw blades to eliminate the buildup of pitch. At noon, regardless of the weather, cookies brought dinner on sleds to where the lumberjacks were working in the woods. Dinner might have consisted of a hearty soup, warmed-up breakfast leftovers, bread, coffee, tea, cookies, and pies.
I always made sure there was vegetables and fruit on the table. And we had lots of pie. I made lots of raisin pie and dried apple pie because those were supplies that you could buy and keep in camp. You didn't have to have fresh, you couldn't always have fresh fruit.
Sometimes dinner couldn't be delivered overland. When the men were working on a river drive, the food was placed on what was called a wanigan, which was a cook shack on a flatboat. The cook stove and supplies floated down the river inside a tar-papered shack just behind the river drive workers.
When you got to the proper place, you would wanigan and stepped ashore and brought the food out. You had a tablecloth many times. A tablecloth put on boards that were put on stumps or whatever they could, rocks or whatever they could find, as long as it was stationary and the men could come and get the food. But you drained the potatoes in the water, and of course you made your coffee from that.
After 30 minutes, dinner was over. The shanty boys went straight back to work cutting trees or driving logs down a wild river. The trees were cut into 16-foot logs, loaded onto sleighs known as drays, and skidded to their destination. When the temperature dipped below freezing, the lumberjacks used a technique called icing. Water was sprayed onto the logging roads to make it easier for the horses pulling the enormous loads of logs.
They'd already made a track, and they pulled the plug out. Well, then when they pulled the plug out, the water came out, but of course at 10, 15 below, it was kind of cold to get that on the run and get that plug in there without splashing a lot. So it was a cold job, and the younger people got that.
In later years, temporary train tracks were laid when possible on the forest floor, and the wood was hauled out by train. Today it's common to see clearings such as this one showing a path where these temporary tracks once ran.
As they had to move to a new stand of pine, what they would do with that engine is they'd back the cars in there and they'd pick up a whole section of those tracks, lay it on a car, move down, pick up the next section, and move them to another section where they'd cut a trail into the woods. Then they'd lay these tracks into that trail, go in there, cut down the trees, and haul them out again.
When a horse and drag were used, the lumberjacks started up their own competition. The game was to see which camp could pull the largest load of logs with horses. One such load was sent from the Upper Peninsula to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago.
When I was a little girl, I rode out to the camp on an empty sleigh. My dad just went with his sleigh to have the men that were out there to load him up. Then when he was loaded up, and then I got on the log, I had to sit on the load of logs because there wasn't room anymore.
Often logs were dropped off on riverbanks during the winter months. Here the logs sat stationary through the long, cold UP winter. But when the snow melted, nothing could describe the wild, unruly journey the logs and their deliverers were yet to face. They could be called early-day thrill-seekers. They were the river drivers, also known as river hogs. When spring thaw hit the Upper Peninsula, that meant the rivers would be raging with melted snow. The UP waterways carried thousands of logs to sawmills. With a crew of about 24 men, the river hogs literally rode the logs down the river.
They'd have contests, who could roll them the fastest, and who would get dunked the worst and hope your head didn't get squashed between two logs.
The pine logs floated much better than the hemlock and the other timber that came later.
If there's leaves on a tree, it's hardwood. Some of the hardwood will float, but most of it doesn't float well.
The Menominee River carried thousands of logs to the sawmills at the turn of the century, but when the Twin Falls Dam was built in the early 1900s, it caused a problem. To avoid damaging the new structure, the logs were stopped at a floating walkway and directed into a side chute, which guided them safely around the dam and then dumped them back into the river.
When the loggers had kind of quit logging, they would shut this gate off there, but it was not a tight seal, and the water would come down this long log chute. So we would always get an old carpet and jump into the log chute, and we'd go down the log chute and out into the water, and the drop off on the end was about 3 to 4 feet.
Just as an axe and crosscut were important to a shanty boy, a peavey, pike pole, and cant hook were equally as important to a river hog. A pike pole could be up to 20 feet in length with a sharp spiral spike and hook on the end. It was used to handle floating logs. The cant hook was used on land, but was also used for sending logs off the bank into the river and for dislodging logs caught in a river jam. The peavey, very similar to the cant hook, had a strong pointed spike on the end used for rolling and handling logs in the water. River driving was long, hard work that could go on for days at a time. During frigid spring temperatures, the river workers fought to stay warm in waist-deep water. And in warmer weather, they fought the biting bugs such as mosquitoes and no-see-ums. And despite these distractions, they had to be quick on their feet. One wrong move meant death on the river.
If they slipped and fell into the river, they may get out. Or if the logs closed in above them, they're not going to get out. Edward Martin fell down through the logs and didn't come up. And they don't stop the drive for that. The water doesn't stop and say, oh, poor Edward, can we help? It keeps going. So does everybody else.
One of the fellows who was drowned right here, when they told the river boss that Joe had drowned here on the river, they said, that's so. Did you save the PV? The tools were more important. But they didn't have time to bury him then, so they put him in a cellar until spring, when they have time to bury the man.
Well, the river hogs are dancing, look at the old boys fly, doing the flatfoot polka to the river's lullaby. Danger is that dancing gal, to flirt with her each day. You can hear them sing their shanty song as their voices trail away. River high, water flow, ride the logs to the lake below. Don't get caught, no second chance when you miss a step on the river dance. Double time and lift your feet, or else you'll be the devil's street.
In addition to the danger, river hogs had to face hard work and unusual situations, since the logs didn't always float smoothly down the river. As long as the logs kept flowing, there was nothing to worry about, but sometimes the logs would stop and form into jams, some of which became huge. A foreman would locate the log jam and yell to the river hogs, alerting them of the situation. If prying on the jammed logs was unsuccessful, then dynamite was used to blow up the jam and send the logs on their way.
Logs jammed up, as they frequently did, because you have these huge logs by the hundreds coming down a river, and they might not be able to make a turn, or one of them might get out of place, and so they would jam up like jack straws.
And they'd have to wade in there, try to find the key log that was holding up the log jam.
So what these fellas would be doing was going down to the base of a stack of logs in this river to try and find the one that'll let the rest of them fall on them.
Break it loose with a PV.
And as soon as it starts to go, you better get out of there or you're not going to make it.
The longer you left a jam, the worse it could get, because everything kept coming down the river as they were letting them out.
Marks were placed on the ends of logs with either axes or stamp hammers. Similar to cattle brands, log markings identified what company owned which piece of wood. One company alone could have had up to 100 different log markings, depending on which sawmill the log was heading to and for what purpose. According to an 1842 Michigan law, each log mark was supposed to be registered with a county clerk's office in which the logs were floated and milled. The larger companies, however, never bothered actually registering their marks. Their stamps were just simply known and recognized by the sorters.
It was was either a letter, a number, combinations. Sometimes there was fanciful designs like a snowshoe or a foot or a geometric design, a star, something like that.
The Diamond Match Company out of Ontonagon had hundreds of marks, and they made white pine logs into matches and shipped them off to have the sulfur put on the front, but they made the matches in Ontonagon. In Delta County, there were so many log marks, they made up a special form that you had to fill out.
Once the logs were sorted by their marks, then they were scaled. By using a special stick, men could estimate the number of board feet per log. There were different systems used for scaling, but the men who performed this task were not trusted much.
They called those scaling sticks the cheat stick. Big money changed hands based on their estimate. Big plans were made. The log scale was a general estimate. There are a number of scales, probably over 100. The first scale was a Scribner scale invented in 1846. The next one was Doyle around the Civil War. But there's local variations.
By the early 1920s, the river drives were drying up. The reason? The lumberjacks were running out of white pines.
Environmental things weren't as important as they are today. There were trees out there to be cut when they were gone. Well, we'll go someplace else and cut some more trees.
We haven't recovered the eastern white pine, and I don't think we ever will. Today, they've got the transportation and they've got the crews that they can cut small areas and still be profitable. In 1890, they didn't have the crews and they didn't have the transportation to make it profitable. So they had to cut everything.
Today, modern-day lumberjacks operate quite differently from their predecessors. During the white pine era, it took at least 2 men several hours to cut down a tree, depending on its size. Today, modern machinery, such as this harvester, requires only 1 operator, and the tallest tree crashes to the ground in a matter of seconds. Modern-day lumberjacks only break from their work for 2 months in the spring due to the weight limitations on roads when thawing occurs. However, early lumberjacks found employment in the woods only from late fall to early spring. It was easier to transport wood from the forest on frozen ground. Some, however, did find year-round employment in the lumber company offices. One such person was William Scott Crow. At the age of 17, Crow traveled alone to Manistee, Michigan on May 29, 1893. Crow wrote that he had never seen a ship, large body of water, or tall trees before. Whether by the river runs of the white pine era or by sleigh, train, or truck, most of the lumber cut in the woods went to sawmills. Several municipalities in the UP are named after former sawmills, such as Stevenson, Kearney, and Wallace. There was once a mill nearly every mile along various large rivers throughout the Upper Peninsula. Lumberjacks, who became unemployed in the summer, took jobs in the mills until work was available once again in the woods.
Millions and millions of board feet came down these rivers. Every river you can name in the Upper Peninsula came down these rivers to the sawmills. They ran 9 camps a season up along the Indian River, the Manistee River, the Driggs River. The sawmills at the mouth of every stream, they went night and day, and then the light from those lit up the sky. For instance, the Menominee River had between 34 and 43 sawmills at the mouth of that river, and Manistee had 4 or 5.
They'd haul them to a hot pond, dump them in a hot pond, and hopefully this would wash off some of the sand and dirt and such that's liable to dull the saws. And the guys in the hot pond then with pike poles, some of them would get out and hike around on those logs like the river hogs did, but most of them on the side with a pike pole would lead these logs over to a bull chain. This was just an endless chain that went round and round like this, and it had teeth in it. And you'd run a log up against that chain, and a tooth would grab that log, and it'd haul it up to the sawmill, and then they'd roll it onto the car carriage and start cutting it up.
When they were cut into planks, and maybe as they got further down the line, they were planed or cut into smaller, whatever the market was requiring. If you needed 2x4s, well, they got those got many 2x4s out of a big wide plank. And I suppose it depended on the size of the tree, what you could get out of it.
Entrepreneurs were always looking for other opportunities. When the white pines disappeared, hardwood trees became a focus for harvesting. One company, called IXL in Hermansville, Michigan, began manufacturing hardwood floors. A museum today, the building which was once a bustling IXL office building, pays tribute to the men and women who worked in the lumber business.
My great-grandfather, C.J.L. Meyer, was an immigrant from Germany. When he had logged off all the pine, he decided there must be some use for the hardwoods. And so he invented the very first machines that made hardwood flooring with the tongue and groove. And actually, this is Hermansville's claim to fame because that was placed in important buildings all over the United States, including the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City, and in the lodges at the Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, and all over the country.
They sold it, carloads of it, especially to the west. There's a record, there were 52 carloads in 1 year went to one dealer in California. The flooring company just died away. The 1940s during the war, when linoleum and all that sort of carpeting came in, there was not much use for hardwood flooring anymore.
At 6 o'clock, lumberjacks made the long journey back to camp after 12 hours of hard work in the woods. Traces of these camps are still visible today. Throughout the woods of the Upper Peninsula, the ground still forms an outline of where a bunkhouse or cook shack once stood. Ironically, this tall white pine grows where a lumber camp building once stood, housing men who harvested white pines for a living. When the early day lumberjacks made it back to camp, the blacksmiths would repair broken equipment, and most importantly, the saw filer sharpened the saws for use the next day. The horses were brushed down and put into their stalls. The shanty boys removed their wet wool clothes and wet boots and hung them to dry around the stove in the bunkhouse. In really cold weather, sometimes the lumberjacks would hang their clothes outside to kill lice and other pesky infestations that tried to cling to the lumberjacks' body heat.
Nature supplied them lice because you had traveling lumberjacks from all over, and some of them probably hadn't taken a bath for months, you know, their clothes dirty, which any lumberjack that was an old-timer, he didn't get a bath every week like the rest of us.
And they had to fight the mosquitoes and the black flies, just like we do today. And they had some of their own concoctions. I know lots of them used lard. They used citronella. They had various mixings of these things. They smeared their faces and so on with these concoctions, and they were kind of a fearsome-looking sight sometimes. I don't know how effective they were. There was no way you can fight those mosquitoes. But in the camps, lice and bed bugs were a problem.
Not all lumber camps had poor living conditions. In 1916, Detroit area automobile manufacturer Henry Ford bought 550,000 acres of UP land. On this land, he owned and operated sawmills and lumber camps. The camps had running water for bathing, and clean linens were provided once a week for the bunkhouses. Lumberjacks who worked for Ford became known as lumber ladies because their lives were considered pampered.
Henry Ford was a real fanatic on cleanliness and tidiness and everything, so those lumber camps were unbelievable. There were no other lumber camps like them, and the superintendents, they lived like royalty, you know. They had little cottages that they lived in.
Ford brought with him big city wages, and in the late 1920s he became the largest employer in the UP with up to 10,000 employees. Ford harvested maple, yellow birch, ash, and red oak trees from the land for making parts for his automobiles in Dearborn, Michigan. Back in the Model T era, Ford Motor Company required approximately 250 feet of lumber for each car built.
All the floorboards and the firewalls and the side panels and the roof, that was all hardwood.
Not only did Ford manufacture wooden parts for his automobiles, but during World War II, the use of his lumber took on a different shape at a plant in Iron Mountain.
Henry Ford got into war production, on a lot of fronts. And up in the Upper Peninsula, he got into production of gliders for the Normandy invasion. They would carry as many as 24 people on one glider, and they could land them behind the lines, and that was the only time they used the glider.
They were incredible, and we made something like 7,500 of them during the war.
Ford and his UP lumber leftovers also played an important role in the backyard barbecue. Ford was a businessman who didn't like waste, and he was interested in what byproduct could be made from the sawdust from his mills. So someone told him about the chemical properties of wood, and this information sparked an industry.
In the early days, Henry Ford actually appointed a friend, actually a person that married his cousin, an Edward Kingsford. And Edward Kingsford kind of was the superintendent of all of the mining and the lumbering in the UP. Now, it was very interesting. Henry Ford didn't like waste at all, so Kingsford said, you know what, I'm going to figure out a way that we can use all that sawdust that we burn every night at the sawmill. So literally, he took the sawdust that they had burned up and put a binder with it and formed charcoal briquettes. And if you go to the store today, a lot of the charcoal you buy still has the name Kingsford on it.
Henry Ford's lumber operations reached their peak in the 1930s and then tapered off with only very limited activity in the 1950s when the Ford Motor Company's UP lumbering days finally came to a close.
Unfortunately, Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company saw the horizon, they saw the future. And way back in the early 30s, we knew that the lumber era was coming to an end. Plastics were being developed, and of course the use of steel was being used throughout the car. New steel processes made it possible to make the steel real thin so you could shape it better. You didn't need the wood in there to reinforce it and put the ribs in. You could make ribs out of steel metal. So consequently, actually we started selling off some of the vast holdings up here only 10 years after we started developing them. By the 30s, we started looking at selling some of this property off.
While Henry Ford brought innovations in pay and living conditions to his UP logging camps, the generally poor conditions of most camps became an issue that led to action in May of 1937. Nearly 6,000 UP lumberjacks went on strike. The protests began in the western Upper Peninsula in Gogebic County and went as far east as Newberry, and at times the demonstrations turned violent. The striking workers were asking for higher wages and better living conditions, such as clean linens and running water. In August of 1937, the strike was finally called off after living conditions and pay became satisfactory among the workers. Most lumber camps even did away with the double bunks, but the work stoppage had affected some logging companies worse than others. Small companies were forced into bankruptcy, also known as gone haywire. But life continued for the lumberjack. The only day off for woodsmen was Sunday. During the White Pine era, lumberjacks were viewed as gentlemen outside the camps.
The men were nice. I never saw a lumberjack get out of place around camp.
During the 1930s, however, lumberjacks were viewed quite differently. According to a July 1942 Detroit News article, the 1930s was a wild and dangerous time in Seney, Michigan. While peaceful today, the town was quoted as being the Gomorrah of the Middle West. It was reported the inhabitants, mainly lumberjacks, fought, knifed, and gouged each other under the flickering lights of 20 saloons. While lumberjacks were described as notorious drinkers, alcohol was not allowed in the logging camps. If a lumberjack turned up drunk for work or was found concealing alcohol, the lumberjack was let go.
A good old lumberjack was popular. He come to Newberry, there was probably, 9, 10 saloons around, you know. Seney was a big place. But Newberry, they had a lot of boarding houses stuff. The lumberjack would stay out there all winter, come to town in the spring of the year. Then they'd hit the taverns.
There used to be a lot of these families that just a wife and a widow and had kids. Well, they'd have moonshine, and these lumberjacks go in there and stay there. They'd have a place where they'd sleeping on the floor, and that's all they do is drink all day, old moonshine, you know. 3, 4 days and they'd be broke. There's their whole winter steak gone. They're ready to go camp.
They liked to play tricks. I mean, they had nothing else to do at night, so they'd take my brother in, and they weren't allowed to have any wine or beer or anything, but I think ours might have had a little sneaked in once in a while, and they fed my brother some once, and he was shipped back into the big room, and he was just staggering home, and my mother was so mad. Last time my brother ever went into the bunkhouse.
At 7 o'clock, it was supper time. Once again, the shanty boys weren't allowed to talk and had only 30 minutes to eat. After supper, some shanty boys sharpened their axes on grindstones in the bunkhouses, while others simply rested. Some lumberjacks would play cards or tell tales. It was during these times that the legendary lumberjacks were born and ghost stories were shared.
They tell of one fellow who drowned here, and they told about his ghost would walk the floors at Camp B. Of course, the lumberjacks who stayed there said, "Oh yes, I heard him," you know. They all thought they had heard him. And that story persisted as the ghost of Camp B. When our son came back from Vietnam, he was over there mowing the grass one night. He said all of a sudden the lawnmower stopped, so he started it again. Well, he heard somebody call his name, couldn't see anybody there, and after the third time, he got the hint. Of course, our kids knew all about this ghost of Camp B.
Each day for a lumberjack was the same. Up before dawn, work hard all day, return to camp at dark, and back to their bunks for slumber. Axes poised in darkness, waiting to sink back into the trunk of a tree. A lumberjack resting for another day to smell the fresh-cut scent of pine and to feel the roughness of bark on their calloused, overworked hands. At 9 p.m., it was lights out, and time for the tired eyes of the lumberjacks to prepare for yet another day.
Well, the river hogs are dancing, look at the old boys fly, doing the flatfoot polka to the river's lullaby. Danger is the dancing gal, to flirt with her each day. You can hear them sing their shanty song as their voices trail away. River high, water flow, ride the logs to the lake below. Don't get caught, no second chance when you miss a step on the river dance. Double time and lift your feet, or else you'll be the devil's street. It was a sunny day in early May, and the snow was in full melt. The time of year was drawing near, the excitement could be felt. The logs were decked, the rollways checked, and the day got downright warm when a new man came, had a funny name, a young lad known as Johnny Horn. Now Red Jack said, unless you're sick or dead, it's time to start this drive. So break those rolls and grab your poles, come on, let's look alive. Now the river hogs are dancing, look at the old boys fly, doing the flatfoot polka to the river's lullaby. Danger is their dancing gal, to flirt with her each day. You can hear them sing their shanty song as their voices trail away. River high, water flow, ride the logs to the lake below. Don't get caught, no second chance when you miss a step on the river dance. Double time and lift your feet, or else you'll be the devil's treat. At the hairpin sweep on the Big Duck Creek, a jam had plugged the way. So a call was sung to have a fly boom strung to hold the other logs in bay. But with the logs held back, it was up to Jack to pick the key to the snarled nest. Found the log to choose, then he lit the fuse and the dynamite quickly did the rest.